Yes, that's where. And I first heard you say, it was a great point. You said, we were winning. We're like, we got the lockdown thing right. We got the masks. They're in retreat on a lot of that stuff. We're making real headway on the vaccine issue, and we did all of that. But then we got fractured, right? And the original fracturing there was a little bit around 9/11, and it's just some conversation around that. And then that was immediately preceded by what just happened in Israel. And so I want to talk about that fracturing, because there's a way we can look at this without getting involved in the complexities of either of those two topics. I want to talk about it from the standpoint of, man, Bret, if they are good at anything, they are fantastic at dividing us. Is that a fair way to look at this?
Yeah, I've called it the coalition slicer dicer, where each new current thing causes the group of people that was beginning to coalesce and learn how to fight effectively together suddenly can't understand each other. And the problem, of course, is that when you see this pattern, it feels like an intentional targeting, but what that implies about historical events is that they're a good bit less organic than they seem, which will, of course, in many people's eyes, make you a wild-eyed conspiracy theorist to even entertain that possibility. But nonetheless, the pattern is what it is. We figure out how to win, and then we upend ourselves in reacting reflexively to whatever the next crisis is. And if I could push a button and teach the skeptics one thing, it would be to stop doing that.
So, but that feels to be, it's not organic, as you say. It feels controlled. It feels contrived. I mean, is that ascribing too much power to them?
Well, I've noticed something about the perils of speaking in public as this pattern unfolds, whatever its cause is, which is that there is an insatiable desire to push you into one of two known positions on every issue. And so if I say something on Twitter, which is where I do some exploring, I mean, really, I was a strange professor. I was not standard when I was a professor, and I'm still doing the same thing, which worked really well in the classroom and frankly works pretty well on podcasts and Twitter. But in the midst of a crisis, if I make an observation about something I don't hear being talked about elsewhere, and I just want to put that observation in people's minds because I want them to wake up and see that there are things, important things, sometimes obvious things that they are looking right past. What happens next is people will look at that thing and they will say, that seems to lean slightly in one direction. Therefore, what he's really saying is that he is embracing that position, and I'm now going to go after him with the arguments that I know are responsive to that position. Where what I'm really trying to do, I mean, it's like bowling. I'm trying to stay out of two gutters. And the point is, if I, point something out that is a little closer to one gutter than the other, then the point is, oh, you're in that gutter immediately. And it's like, look, you're never going to think your way out of any of these crises if that's the way you play it. You're dealing with complex systems. These things aren't binary, and you can't tell who's making sense by what flag they're waving. It just doesn't work like that.
Well, isn't this what we all went through with I mean, I'm old enough. I went through this with George W. Bush, right? And so they said, axis of evil, you're either with the terrorists or you're, with us. And they just created this left-right dynamic. You're either on this side or that side. And that's what I feel is the prime sin that we're experiencing here, is that they constantly say there's only one of two positions. You have to choose, but it's a false choice, right? There are nuances that belong in here. And it was the same thing with, well, here's what happens. So this happened to me. I would have told you flat out prior to COVID, on no uncertain terms, I am not an anti-vaxxer. Now, because they in this story, the opposition has said, well, Chris, you either are one or you aren't one. And if you ask any questions at all, then you are one. And they wore me down, Bret. And now I just go, yeah, I'm an anti-vaxxer. You've won the rhetorical left-right dynamic, and you forced me to choose. And it's not the choice I think you wanted me to take. But I feel that same polemic being stood up, which is you have to choose between two things when there's actually a third choice, which is neither position, that actually makes sense.
Well, I mean, maybe the thing to do is we've got to level up our game here. And in fact, the more I think about it, the more likely it is that something in this quadrant is right. I mean, there are places that are quite binary. And so it doesn't make sense to pretend, for example, that you're not either with the terrorists or the flat earthers. And I don't know which one you are, but you're in one of those two camps. And so,
Yeah.
I'd love to find out, because I'd hate to think you were in the opposite camp, but if you are, then so be it. So, Chris, is it terrorists or flat earthers? Yeah. I mean, I don't know, but somehow I feel like, first of all, Heather and I are very unlikely influencers. We were very at home in the classroom. That's not an influencer role. That's a kind of analytical mentor role. And the idea that this would have any important role in public is seems strange to me every day. On the other hand, the job of getting you to see that which maybe should be obvious but isn't, that's what we do. And this incessant defining of teams is, of course, not only destructive of our ability to do anything useful, but it is analytically insane. If you want to get the Middle East right, for example, you should be obsessed with figuring out what should be on the map that for whatever reason isn't. You need to find those things. And the idea that each time you discover something that's not on the map, that it's going to, that you have to shoehorn it into a binary team narrative, obviously that's wrong. Flag waving is not analysis. And it doesn't matter whether or not ultimately you're going to end up under one flag or another. The point is, you should end up there as the result of a process of analysis that tells you this is actually the right place to stand, if at all. And I'm sure you're in some version of this as well, but I'm living a nightmare because I'm trying to say something that I think is really important about what's going on in the Middle East. It's much more important than the current conflict, as terrifying as the current conflict actually is, and as destructive as the potential of that conflict actually is. I'm trying to say something about why that conflict doesn't resolve and what would have to be accomplished in order for us to put it to rest forever. And the problem is, it is being viewed. You remember back in the early days of computer games, where there were a lot of low resolution games that had, whatever the thing was that you were after was rendered in very large blocks, right? It's like forcing everything into a narrative in which everything is rendered so crudely that it couldn't possibly be useful, right? How do you just get people to just calm down and not jump to conclusions about what a person is saying as they are trying to figure out how to view the conflict from a perspective that is both useful and non-standard? It seems simple that we should all want to do that, and everybody's so terrified that the other side is going to win a point that it's like not allowed.
Well, I think you're the perfect person to talk about, not just because of how your logical brain is structured, but from an evolutionary standpoint. Can we just back up a second? So, from an evolutionary standpoint, how do we understand war?
Well, I'll start with the shallow end of the pool, and then I'll move to deeper water. I may have said this even in our last conversation, but it bears repeating. Heather's PhD advisor is a guy named Arnold Kluge, still alive, still very, very vital. When you went into his office to talk to him, you sat in, a particular chair facing the side of his file cabinet, which had one and only one note on it. which he had very carefully placed there. The note was, it's about power and limiting resources, stupid. It's that. So the idea that you're going to look at a conflict in which a huge amount of megatonnage is being dropped and a huge number of people are being destroyed, and you are going to imagine that this is actually about a difference in epistemology, right? A difference in belief about the way the universe works. No, it isn't. At the very least, you need to start looking at what the resources are, and the resource may be land, but you have to look at what the resources are, and you have to look at the players, both the ones that you can see in the video of the conflict and the ones that are hidden, that are pushing others into conflict for reasons that you probably know very little about. So power and limiting resources, that's what all conflicts where people are dying in large numbers are about. So you have to at least say, until I see what the power and limiting resources are, I'm not informed.
Right.
But it's also the case, and this is a major frustration I have with my evolutionary colleagues. When human beings engage in warfare or genocide, and really I see those two things as different flavors of the same process, you are either engaging in a fight to the death over a border, then it's war, or you're doing it within a border, and then it's genocide. And so it is not wrong to look at the impulses that cause human beings to engage in this very expensive and perilous behavior as similar. You can have, to say that a war might have genocidal impetus is not incorrect in general. But why? Well, you should at least notice that when populations go to war with each other, that they end up reducing the number of resources that belong to a competing lineage. Now, I say that I'm frustrated with my evolutionary colleagues about this, because when I say something like that, I get a ton of pushback, which makes no sense, because what I'm saying is evolutionary wins, especially patterns that extend back indefinitely into human history and prehistory. When you win evolutionarily, it is unlikely to be pure accident. And if it is pure accident, it will happen once. It will not be a pattern. So the fact that human beings have a thing called war that they do engage in, and when you win one, it tends to result in more resources going to your population, and just by accident tends to reduce the number of resources that go to some competing population, and that those populations aren't loosey-goosey. Those populations tend to be people who are genetically more distant. The ones that you are going to war against tend to be genetically more distant than you are to the ones on your team in a war. So that's evolutionarily as you would expect. So why is it that, any evolutionist, pick anybody who studied the topic, and you look at the behavior of a bowerbird, which is, of course, utterly paradoxical and bizarre, but there's no disagreement amongst any group of evolutionists about whether or not they are doing what they are doing for an underlying genetic purpose, that they are advancing their genes into the future by behaving in ways that are difficult for us to understand. But if we look at people that happen to be behaving in ways that obviously move their genes into the future in some predictable way, and we say, well, that's actually evolution in action, doing something that has nothing to do with the content of what's being said about this conflict, then the answer is no, it's culture. You're extrapolating, you're applying Darwinian tools where they don't belong. And it's like, no, that's nonsense. The burden of proof, if you think that human beings are advancing their genetic interests accidentally again and again across history, the burden is on you to establish how that could possibly be the case. So my point is, like it or not, evolutionary tools at least belong in every conversation where we are trying to figure out what warfare is about, trying to prevent it. And I will go one step further, and I will just say, if you really believe in never again, if there are things you just never want to see, not one more time in history, then maybe it is true that if we talk about these things in the proper evolutionary terms, we will not find a solution, but it's our best hope. If you try to prevent that conversation because at the moment you want to talk about how awful the people on the other side are, you are preventing us from accessing the one tool that might solve it.
I completely agree. I resonate with all of that. And this is exactly the conversation I wanted to have because um, so let's admit that somewhere in our evolutionary past, the wiring, the circuitry got installed that enables something like war. And war isn't like this one-off that accidentally happened because of some culture. Every single culture I can show you has some warlike tendency around it because they bumped up against a tribe. And this whole idea of the noble savage, and they were all living in peace in the Garden of Eden, not true, right? They generally speaking were in conflict with the neighboring tribes. So that is just writ large now. And so I want to rotate this conversation to this one direction because to put two pieces together to say that fundamentally all wars at heart are about resources, whether that's power or physical resources like oil. True, in my mind. Okay. And the second thing is that we have this wired into us. But here's the thing. We can see in individual cases, in small examples, that we can break that wiring. We can be both and, right? We can be both these hardwired for conflict species that seems destined to shoot itself in both feet and a couple of kneecaps, or we can be these evolved, more sentient beings that can separate from that. So I'm wondering how can we begin to maybe load the dice to begin to navigate to this other state that we know we're capable of because I can give you examples, right? So I want to know how to get there. And this came to me in a blinding insight a while ago when I was talking with a woman who is an executive coach. And she said, "Oh, these executives, they want more, they want this, they want to be better at executiving, and they want this and they want that." And she usually lets them settle down about 2-3 months of prying and prodding. And she said, "Chris, my job is to get them to understand that the gateway word to happiness is enough." That's where the critical insight comes in because they already have enough. They don't think they're still operating from a scarcity mindset. So I submit to you that I see these billionaires with their mega yachts and jet fleets and 5 trophy properties and 3 ex-trophy wives and all of that. They just haven't found they don't have an on-off switch. They haven't found enough. There's never enough. So I submit that if we can't get into enough, we can't we'll just stay in what you call condition A or lineage approach. So what have you seen that helps you understand the ways in which we can actually break our programming, as it were, and use that wonderful human adaptability to be something other than that?
If you know how to look at this, you know exactly where we are in history. This is a contraction that is going to cause a massive wave of anti-Semitism. It is going to cause increasing warlikeness across all populations. And you are exactly right that what this is going to do, it is going to drag us back into the Old Testament. And
I need a definition because I just haven't been close enough to it and I haven't lived it. So please pardon my ignorance, but I think I'm asking for a lot of people. I don't know what anti-Semitism means. Is that against the genes? Is it against the culture? Is it against a political orientation? What is, can you help me understand what that means?
Yes, I am using it in the sloppiest way because I don't have a better term that people know. So I'm sort of caught between, and for one thing, in the Israel-Palestine context, you've got technically Semites on both sides. So I am just simply using it as a substitute for saying Jew hatred because I can't stand that term, right? Okay. That term, just for multiple reasons, it's not the right term. For one thing, it's a new term. And the point is, actually, this is a historical pattern for a reason. And it has always been called anti-Semitism. And so I want people to understand that I am referring to that long history, and I'm doing so for a reason. This is not, this is a pattern that is comprehensible. Now, you point to something very interesting and complex when you allude to the fact that you have various different lineages that are adhering to the same sacred texts, right? The Jews that are derived from populations that were living in the Middle East are quite different than the Jews who were living in Europe, of which there were two different stripes. So why it is that you have multiple different lineages that are united by a sacred text is a complex story. It involves understanding that these texts are products of evolution. They are not products of genetic evolution, but that ought to make very little difference to you. The most important way in which it is relevant is that cultural evolution, which is equally biological as genetic evolution, has a special tool, which is that it can move horizontally between populations. So a sacred text can jump into a new population, and those people can recognize each other as effectively allies. Now, those allyships can break down. In other words, the subpopulations, just as you have sectarian violence in Christendom, between Protestants and Catholics, for example, you have every potential for sectarian differences, which are really proxy for genetic differences, to break out amongst lineages of Jews too. And this is certainly nowhere more relevant than it is in Islam. The number of people from different lineages who subscribe to Islam is also large. So in each of these cases, we're having to speak in some simple terms simply to get anywhere. So I'm saying anti-Semitism is the result of Jews living in a surprising way. The analogy I would use is, every time I see a hummingbird, I think I would never have thought, if I was a creator, I would never have thought to design that creature. It's too strange. The high throughput of energy, right, in this tiny, fragile thing that can't afford to store any energy on its body, that sounds like a dead end to me. And yet it obviously works. Jews are a little bit like this. They live as a diaspora, always as a minority population inside of other nations, which is a vulnerable position to be in. I believe that the history of vulnerability, and in fact, the history of persecution, has created a special skill set, which is transmitted culturally. One of the things I would love to see is that skill set just simply democratized, right? There are a lot of, many populations have something to teach all the other populations. Jews have a special toolkit. I've talked about it before. I think a Jewish dinner table in which people hold each other's feet to the fire and search for flaws in each other's arguments, and it's not personal, even if it becomes heated because people believe passionately in what they're saying. That skill set is like, school every day at dinner, and that's useful, right? It's really good, and it is, in my opinion, it is the reason that you have so many Jews who have achieved important things. I'm not a fan of the Nobel Prize in modern times because it's obviously so highly political, but the number of Nobel Prizes that Jews have won across many disciplines is obviously conspicuous. What is that? Oh, I think it's the result of a contagious style of thinking that would be good if it spread, because who knows how many things we're not discovering because there's only a tiny number of Jews doing that thing. So anyway, the point is, culture spreads horizontally, and it is a proxy for underlying genes. Because Jews live as a diaspora, and because they are good at living as a diaspora, they tend to accumulate resources, which means that when times get bad, going after whatever Jews happen to be in your vicinity is a good way of creating phony growth. The only problem is it involves killing people. So that's where we are in history. We're at the point where people suddenly find their resentment for Jews, and I've got to tell you, it's not a comfortable world to live in at the moment if you're Jewish. And if I'm honest, I don't really expect it to go back to normal.